The Galactic Union's Grand War Tournament was the most prestigious event in the universe, a display of precision, strategy, and firepower, where only the most advanced species competed. It was meant to be a celebration of superior technology and skill, and when humanity was finally invited, the aliens expected them to fail spectacularly. The Union's best marksmen came from species that had mastered plasma-guided projectiles and self-correcting energy weapons. Their shots never missed because their weapons did all the calculations for them. But when the humans arrived, they brought something almost laughable: old-fashioned, ballistic firearms that required manual aiming. It was a joke before it even started. The tournament grounds were a massive arena, with floating holographic targets that moved unpredictably. The finest alien sharpshooters demonstrated their prowess first, striking the center of every target with pinpoint accuracy. The audience, a collection of high-ranking military leaders from across the galaxy, clapped politely as one by one, each contestant took their turn. Then it was humanity's time to shoot. The first human soldier stepped forward, raised his weapon, and fired. The bullet missed the target completely. A stunned silence was followed by muffled laughter. The second soldier fired again, a miss. Whispers spread among the alien spectators, some shaking their heads in disappointment, others openly chuckling. "Primitive weapons, primitive skills," one of them muttered. The third soldier stepped up, took careful aim, and fired. The bullet sailed past the target, hitting a nearby metallic plate, ricocheting at an odd angle, and disappearing into the distance. A moment later, a faint sound echoed from behind the target as something struck a hidden trigger, causing the floating sphere to deactivate. The laughter quieted, but most dismissed it as a fluke. However, the humans continued their strange pattern. None of their shots hit the targets directly, yet every single one of them ended up striking something, sometimes after bouncing off multiple surfaces. Some bullets even curved through narrow gaps, weaving through obstacles in ways no alien had ever considered. At first, the audience didn't understand what was happening, but when the final results were displayed, showing the humans had successfully eliminated every single target from behind or at impossible angles, the mood shifted. Confusion turned into quiet concern. The alien judges reviewed the footage in disbelief. Unlike their own weapons, which relied on direct hits, the human strategy seemed chaotic, unpredictable, but it was working. They weren't just shooting at the targets, they were manipulating the environment, using angles and surfaces in ways that no other species had ever attempted. Their bullets weren't missing. They were calculated. The realization sent an uncomfortable ripple through the audience. If this was how humans competed in a mere tournament, what would they be like in actual warfare? One of the alien officers, a veteran of many battles, narrowed his eyes as he watched a slowed-down replay. The humans never looked directly at their targets. Instead, they scanned the terrain, adjusting their shots based on what was around the target rather than the target itself. They weren't aiming for what was obvious. They were aiming for what no one else saw. The Union's best marksmen prided themselves on never missing their shots, but it became clear that humans had evolved an entirely different philosophy, never needing to aim directly at all. For the first time, the Galactic Union saw something they had never expected from humanity: not brute force, not reckless aggression, but a terrifying level of foresight. The aliens had always assumed superior weaponry determined the outcome of a battle, but now they realized that humans didn't fight based on just firepower. They fought with their minds. And they fought to win. ASS, the human soldiers lowered their weapons and walked away from the range. There was no smugness, no boasting, just quiet confidence. They had proven their point. They had never been aiming for the target. And now, every military leader in the galaxy was left with a single haunting thought: if we ever go to war with them, how do you fight an enemy whose bullets are already on their way before you even realize you've lost? The silence in the tournament hall was deafening. Moments ago, the alien spectators had been laughing, mocking humanity's poor aim. But now, as the results were displayed on the massive holographic screens, confusion spread like wildfire. The humans had not only hit every single target, but had done so in a way that defied logic. Their bullets had ricocheted off surfaces, curved around obstacles, and struck from blind angles. It wasn't luck. It was something else, something unsettling. The judges replayed the footage in slow motion, analyzing every frame. What they saw sent a chill through even the most battle-hardened generals. The human soldiers hadn't been missing at all. They had been calculating. Every single shot had been deliberate, sent on a precise trajectory that only made sense when viewed from a broader perspective. No alien species had ever trained like this before. Every other military in the galaxy relied on guided weapons, on advanced targeting systems that ensured a direct hit. But the humans? They didn't shoot at what was in front of them. They shot at where the enemy would never expect. A veteran officer from the HFY Dominion, a race known for their sniper accuracy, frowned as he studied the footage. He zoomed in on one particular shot, a bullet fired at a steel plate positioned at an odd angle. At first glance, it seemed like another miss, but the slowed-down replay showed the bullet bouncing off the plate, flying through a narrow gap between two barriers, and striking the target from behind. The HFY officer's mandibles twitched. "That's not instinct," he murmured. "That's planning." Others were coming to the same realization. This wasn't random. This wasn't recklessness. It was a strategy. One that none of them had ever encountered before. In the Galactic Union's long history of warfare, every species had followed the same basic principle. The shortest distance between 2 points was a straight line. But humans had rewritten that rule entirely. For them, the battlefield was not just a space to be controlled, it was a puzzle to be solved. A nervous murmur spread among the audience. If this was how humans fought in a controlled environment, how could anyone defend against an enemy that didn't shoot at them but around them? The implications were terrifying. One of the tournament's judges, a four-armed strategist from the Rilthak Empire, clenched his fists. "We underestimated them," he admitted. "They don't fight like us. They don't think like us." A general from the Zorvath fleet, a reptilian species that had dominated space combat for centuries, shook his head in disbelief. "Their weapons are outdated, but their minds are more dangerous than any technology we have." The realization hung heavy in the air. Every war ever fought in the galaxy had followed predictable patterns: superior firepower, superior numbers, superior technology. But humanity had just proven that battles weren't won by weapons alone. They were won by how you use them. The lead human officer, a man named Captain Reynolds, stood at the edge of the range, watching the alien audience with a neutral expression. He could see it in their eyes: the doubt, the fear, the slow realization that the tournament had just become something far more important. His soldiers remained silent, their expressions unreadable. They knew exactly what they had done. They knew the message they had just sent. It wasn't about winning a simple competition. It was about demonstrating something far more valuable: unpredictability. Every species in the Galactic Union had perfected their own methods of warfare. They had mastered precision, strength, and speed. But none of them had ever prepared for the one thing that humans excelled at: adapting. For years, the Union had viewed humanity as a lesser species, an upstart race that had only recently discovered space travel. They saw humans as reckless, unrefined, and unsophisticated in their combat techniques. But now, in a matter of minutes, that perception had been shattered. The aliens watching from the stands weren't just witnessing a new style of marksmanship. They were witnessing the birth of a new kind of warfare. A warfare where direct attacks were useless, where predictable strategies meant death, and where every bullet fired was a trap waiting to be sprung. One of the younger alien cadets, a bright-eyed strategist in training, turned to his mentor with a look of fear. "How do we defend against something like this?" he asked in a hushed whisper. His mentor, an old general who had fought in dozens of interstellar wars, did not answer. Immediately, he simply watched as the humans holstered their weapons and walked away, their faces calm and unreadable. Finally, after a long pause, the general muttered, "You don't. Because how do you fight an enemy who doesn't aim for the target but for everything else around it?" The tournament was supposed to be a mere demonstration of skill, a show of precision and control, where the best marksmen from across the galaxy competed to prove their species' superiority. But after humanity's display, the air in the arena had changed. The laughter had died, the smug expressions had faded, and now, only a heavy silence remained. The alien spectators, once amused by humanity's so-called poor aim, were now replaying the footage in their minds, over and over, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. The humans had never aimed for the targets directly, yet they had hit every single one with terrifying accuracy. Their bullets had danced through the air, bouncing off surfaces, curving through tight spaces, striking from impossible angles. The shots had been deliberate, planned with a level of tactical thinking that no other species had ever considered. The realization of what this meant was beginning to sink in, and for the first time in centuries, the Galactic Union's finest warriors felt something they had never associated with humans. In a private observation chamber, high above the arena, a group of high-ranking military officials from various alien empires sat in stunned silence, their eyes locked on the holographic screens, displaying slow-motion replays of the human soldiers' performance. The more they analyzed the footage, the more unsettling it became. They weren't shooting at the targets, muttered Admiral Excelthar of the Dravari Dominion, his clawed fingers drumming against the metal table. They were shooting at opportunities. His words carried weight, and the others in the room shifted uneasily. The Galactic Union had fought countless wars, had conquered entire civilizations, had crushed rebellions with overwhelming firepower, but this was something entirely different. The humans hadn't just demonstrated skill, they had demonstrated foresight, an ability to manipulate the battlefield in ways that no other species could. They didn't aim at where the enemy was. They aimed at where the enemy would never expect. General Korvek of the Zorvath fleet, a battle-hardened commander who had led his forces to victory in over 100 campaigns, rewound the footage for what must have been the 10th time. His reptilian eyes narrowed as he studied a single shot, in particular a bullet that had ricocheted 3 times before striking its target from behind. This level of calculation. It's not instinct, he said in a low, measured tone. It's not luck. It's not even just skill. This is something else entirely. Something dangerous. He leaned back, his armored tail twitching. We train our soldiers to fire straight, to rely on their weapons technology to do the work for them. But these humans, they see the battlefield differently. To them, every wall, every obstacle, every reflective surface is a weapon waiting to be used. They don't just fire bullets. They set traps. The weight of those words settled over the room like a suffocating fog. There was no denying it. Humanity had just demonstrated a method of combat that no existing military doctrine accounted for. Every species in the Union relied on precision, guided targeting, and overwhelming firepower. Their battles were fought with numbers, with superior technology, with strategy that followed predictable patterns. But the humans? They had just introduced a terrifying new concept into the art of war: unpredictability. Down in the arena, the human soldiers remained expressionless as they were congratulated for their performance. There were no celebrations, no signs of arrogance, only quiet professionalism. They knew what they had just done. They had turned what was supposed to be a simple tournament into a warning. And the aliens had received the message loud and clear. If this was how humanity trained, what would they be like in actual war? How do you defend against an enemy that doesn't need direct line of sight? How do you prepare for a species that thinks in dimensions you don't even consider? The Galactic Union had always assumed that war was about firepower, about having the biggest fleet, the strongest weapons, the most advanced targeting systems. But humans had just shattered that belief. They had proven that war wasn't about hitting the target. It was about controlling the battlefield itself. A nervous murmur spread among the lower-ranked officers in the observation chamber. If the humans could do this with simple ballistic weapons, what could they do with plasma rifles? With railguns? With gravity-based projectiles? The thought was chilling. And then another, even darker realization settled in. Humanity had never been considered a major power in the galaxy. They were newcomers, still finding their place among the stars. But what if that had been intentional? What if they had been hiding their true capabilities all along? What if every other species had made the same mistake, assuming humanity was weak, primitive, unsophisticated, when in reality, they had been watching, learning, preparing? Across the room, an older officer, a veteran of the Union's most brutal conflicts, exhaled slowly, and placed his hands on the table. "We always thought we were the hunters," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But now I wonder if we've just met the real predators." His words sent a shiver through the gathered commanders, because deep down, they all knew the truth. If war ever came, humanity wouldn't fight like the other species. They wouldn't engage in straightforward battles. They wouldn't rely on brute force. They would strike from the shadows, from angles no one saw coming. And by the time the enemy realized what was happening, it would already be too late. Back in the arena, Captain Reynolds and his team of soldiers exchanged silent glances before exiting the competition grounds. They had no need to stay and bask in the moment. They had already done what they came here to do. They had shattered the illusion of alien superiority. They had planted the seed of doubt in the minds of the galaxy's most powerful war leaders. And that was far more valuable than any trophy. The Galactic Union had hosted war games for centuries, a grand spectacle where the strongest military forces of the known universe competed in simulated battles. These events were designed to showcase tactical brilliance, test new technology, and strengthen alliances. But this time, something was different. The mood was tense, the air thick with unspoken fears. Ever since humanity's unsettling display of marksmanship in the tournament, whispers had spread through military ranks like wildfire. Their unusual combat style had left generals and tacticians questioning everything they knew. And now, with the war games beginning, the real test was about to unfold. First, the games proceeded as expected. Alien armies deployed their forces across a massive simulated battlefield, using strategies honed over centuries of interstellar warfare. Squadrons of elite soldiers moved in perfect coordination, heavy artillery fired with surgical precision, and aerial units executed flawless bombing runs. The simulations were designed to mimic real warfare as closely as possible, with artificial casualties and strategic objectives that forced competitors to think several steps ahead. But then, the humans made their move and the war games took a dark turn. Their forces did not engage in direct confrontations. They did not form defensive lines or push for control of key positions like every other species. Instead, they disappeared. Small teams of human operatives slipped through the battlefield, vanishing into the terrain, avoiding detection. At first, it seemed like cowardice, as if they were refusing to fight head-on. The other competitors scoffed, assuming the humans simply didn't have the numbers or firepower to hold their ground. But then, things started going wrong. Supply convoys went missing without a trace. Command centers found their communications jammed at crucial moments. Automated turrets, designed to provide cover for advancing troops, suddenly turned against their own allies, reprogrammed in ways no one had anticipated. By the time the other teams realized what was happening, chaos had already spread across the battlefield. Units were cut off from reinforcements. Entire platoons were led into traps they never saw coming. And worst of all, the humans never attacked directly. They simply manipulated the battlefield, forcing their enemies into destroying themselves. In the Union's war games, every species had always fought the same way through overwhelming strength, superior technology, and coordinated force. Battles were won by crushing the enemy beneath sheer firepower. But the humans had rewritten the rules. They didn't fight to control territory. They fought to control the mind. They let their enemies feel safe, let them think they were winning until it was too late. A fleet commander from the Zorvath Empire, watching from a high command station, clenched his. In one particularly brutal moment, an entire battalion of heavily armored Dravari warriors was advancing toward what they believed was an exposed human outpost. They had studied human battle tactics, expecting the enemy to make a last stand or retreat under pressure. But when they stormed in, weapons ready, they found nothing. Just empty terrain. Confused, they halted their advance, scanning the area for hidden enemies. Then, without warning, a series of explosions erupted around them, not from enemy fire, but from their own ammunition reserves. The humans had planted decoys, redirecting the Dravari forces into a kill zone of their own making. Observers watching the war games from the Galactic Union's central station fell into a stunned silence. This was no longer a contest of skill. It was psychological warfare. The aliens realized, far too late, that they weren't just losing battles. They were losing control. Panic spread through command centers as generals scrambled to counter the humans' unconventional tactics. But how do you fight an enemy that never fights the way you expect? In the final hours of the war games, the battlefield had become eerily quiet. The once mighty war machines of the other species lay in ruins, not from direct conflict, but from mistakes they had been tricked into making. The last remaining alien forces, battered and demoralized, found themselves in a desperate position. Their weapons were still functional, their numbers still superior, but none of them dared to advance. They were afraid of an enemy they couldn't see, afraid of traps they couldn't predict, afraid that any move they made would play directly into the humans' hands. The fear had settled deep into their minds, and now it controlled them. Then, without warning, the war games ended. The human forces emerged from the shadows, completely unscathed. They had never needed to engage in direct battle. They had won the war before their enemies even knew they were fighting it. As the final results were displayed, the realization hit hard: this was not a war game anymore. This was a warning. In the observation chamber, where military leaders and strategists from across the galaxy had gathered to watch, the tension was unbearable. The highest-ranking officials exchanged uneasy glances. They had believed humanity was just another species in the Union, another faction to be assimilated into the grand military order of the galaxy. But now they saw the truth. Humanity wasn't just another competitor. They were something else entirely. Something terrifying. We always assumed that humans were weak because they lacked the advanced technology we have, he said slowly, his voice trembling. But what if that's exactly what makes them strong? What if they don't need superior technology to win? What if all they need is time to think? No one answered. No one could, because they all knew what this meant. If humanity ever went to war for real, there would be no stopping them. The war games were over. The battlefield, once filled with the roar of weapons and the thunder of marching armies, had fallen silent. The results were undeniable. The humans had not just won, they had dominated. Across the Galactic Union, military leaders sat in stunned disbelief, replaying footage of the conflict over and over, searching for answers. How had a species with such primitive technology defeated the most advanced warriors in the galaxy? How had they crushed forces with superior numbers, better weapons, and centuries of combat experience? The truth was right in front of them, but it was a truth they struggled to accept. Humanity had never aimed to simply defeat their enemies, they had aimed to control the entire battlefield. From the moment the war games had begun, the humans had played a different game altogether. While other species had focused on achieving objectives, securing positions, and eliminating targets, the humans had done something far more dangerous. They had set the stage for victory long before their enemies even realized they were losing. They had never aimed at soldiers, they had aimed at supply lines. They had never attacked defenses, they had turned them against their owners. Every move they made had been part of a larger, invisible strategy that the other species had failed to see until it was far too late. In one of the war rooms overlooking the battlefield, Admiral Selthar of the Dravari Dominion leaned over the control table, his claws gripping its edges tightly. "They don't think like we do," he muttered, his voice laced with unease. "We fight wars by engaging the enemy. They fight wars by shaping the war itself." His subordinates exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to respond. The realization was spreading through every command center, through every species that had participated in the games. The humans had rewritten the very definition of warfare. Among the many disturbing pieces of footage being analyzed, one in particular stood out. It was a recording of a single human sniper, positioned at what seemed like an irrelevant location. He never fired a shot directly at an enemy soldier. Instead, his bullets ricocheted off metal walls, shattered light sources, and hit explosive canisters at exactly the right moment to disrupt enemy movement. With a handful of well-placed shots, he had paralyzed an entire enemy division, not by shooting them, but by manipulating their surroundings. This was what the Union's generals had failed to understand. Humanity did not just aim for their targets. They aimed for control. In another scene, a human strike team infiltrated a heavily fortified alien command post. They could have easily engaged the guards in a firefight, but they didn't. Instead, they bypassed security entirely, hacked into the base's automated defenses, and reprogrammed them to turn against their own forces. Within minutes, the aliens had lost control of their own stronghold, forced to flee from their own weapons. The humans had won without firing a single direct shot. The implications were terrifying. Every species in the Union had always relied on brute force to win battles. They built bigger ships, stronger shields, deadlier weapons. But the humans had proven that raw power was meaningless if you couldn't control the flow of battle. What good was a fleet of unstoppable warships if your supply chains were severed before the battle even began? What good were elite soldiers if their communications were cut off, their reinforcements misdirected, their weapons useless? Humanity had never fought for dominance on the battlefield. They had fought to ensure the battlefield itself belonged to them. In the central war room of the Galactic Union, Supreme Commander Ralvex watched the final tactical breakdown of the games, his 4 eyes narrowing as he grasped the full extent of what had happened. "We always assumed they were unpredictable," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We thought they were reckless, chaotic. But we were wrong. They are not unpredictable. They are uncontrollable." He turned to his advisors, all of whom looked just as shaken. No amount of firepower can stop an enemy that can bend reality to their advantage. Silence hung over the room as the weight of those words settled in. The Union had always prided itself on its military superiority. They had crushed rebellions, conquered lesser species, and maintained order across the galaxy through sheer might. But now, for the first time, they faced an enemy they could not outgun. Humanity had proven that war was not about hitting the target, it was about understanding the game itself. Across the galaxy, military strategists scrambled to adjust their doctrines. New training regimens were discussed, new defensive measures proposed. But deep down, they all knew the truth. It was already too late. The humans had shown them exactly what they were capable of, and that knowledge could never be erased. Even if the Union adapted, even if they studied human tactics and tried to replicate them, it would never be the same. Because while the rest of the galaxy had been perfecting the art of war as they understood it, humanity had been redefining it entirely. Back on the battlefield, as alien soldiers packed up their gear and returned to their ships, a small group of human officers stood watching. Captain Reynolds, the leader of the human forces, glanced at his team with a knowing smile. "They'll spend years trying to figure out how to counter us," he said. "They'll train, they'll adapt, they'll try to make their soldiers think like us." His second-in-command chuckled, shaking his head. "They can try," he said, "but they'll never stop aiming for the target, and that's why they'll always lose." As the human fleet prepared to depart, the final realization settled over the galaxy like a dark cloud. Humanity didn't fight for victory in the way others did. They didn't need superior numbers. They didn't need advanced weapons. All they needed was the ability to think further ahead than anyone else. And when it came to war, that was the deadliest weapon of all.